defeat the Autobots, to control the planet, to conquer the universe!
Transformers Role-Playing Game is a book published by Renegade Studios in 2022. It's an officially licensed treatment of the famous franchise, the rights of which are owned by Hasbro. This is the third Hasbro license that Renegade has adopted into a tabletop RPG, amongst other games. The first was Power Rangers, and the second was G.I. Joe, of which I did a review for. All of these games, including Transformers, use Renegade's Essence 20 system, which I covered in my G.I. Joe video, but I'll do again here. First, I want to break down the Transformers franchise, just so we know what we're working with here. As the official story goes, the franchise got its start as a series of toys produced by Hasbro and Takara Tomy in 1984. These first models were licensed copies of Takara's Diaclone and Microchange toy lines, and just renamed and recolored to fit the nascent Transformers universe. But the creators were limited by law as to how much they could advertise the Transformers to children at the time, so they developed a loophole that came in the form of the cartoon series. The first series, which at the time of this recording you can watch for free on Tubi, ran from 1984 to 1987, with an epic animated movie in 1986. I won't get too into the weeds here on where the franchise has gone since then, but it's worth mentioning that Marvel started a comic series that developed the storyline even before the cartoon started, and the rights to produce the comics has since changed hands to Dreamwave Productions and finally IDW, along with a number of smaller publishers all along the way. And as far as cartoons, they started in 1984 with what's now called Generation 1, but then slowly blossomed into dozens of series that can kind of be grouped into various families. For example, the Beast era comprises Beast Wars, Beast Wars 2, Beast Wars Neo, and Beast Machines. And quite beloved in the fandom is the Unicron trilogy, which is composed of the Armada, Energon, and Cybertron series. It goes on and on with really no sign of stopping even as of now. And then you have the live action movies, mostly directed by Michael Bay. These started in 2007, and sequels coming out every 2 to 3 years, each one worse than the last. Just kidding, I stopped watching them after the second one, so I don't know. After the 4 sequels, there was the Bumblebee spinoff, and for 2023, a Beast Wars one. So with all of this media, and not to mention the metric ton of cool and interesting toys that have been sold all along the way, and all the video games, which maybe are less notable, to be honest, it was weird that there was never an official Transformers tabletop RPG. At least not one I've ever encountered. So when Renegade Studios announced that they were putting one out, I was personally pretty excited. My biggest questions were, what system would it use? That was easy. Renegade's own Essence 20 system, which I'll explain in this video. Where will it be available? Just through Renegade's website for the most part, maybe at local game shops. And finally, what's the lore that they will use for the game? One notable thing about the comics, cartoons, and movies is that they don't respect any kind of coherent canon except in the broadest of senses. This is a tradition that goes back to the very beginning, when the first cartoon series deviated from the Marvel Comics universe that had just been established. One way to illustrate how impossible it is to make sense of the Transformers universe is to watch one of Chris McFeely's great information videos on any particular character. He thoroughly explains the backstory of each character and how their origin and appearance have changed over the decades, sometimes pretty wildly. So even though the canon of Transformers is sort of a mushy mess of conflicting reboots, this RPG works with some basic tenets. There are cybernetic organisms who originated from a cybernetic planet called Cybertron, and within that population there are Autobots and Decepticons who have been at war with each other for millions of years. Actually, the backstory presented in this RPG pretty closely tracks the story presented in the Generation 1 cartoon from 1984. Both sides crash land on Earth and are dormant for 4 million years, at which time they wake up and discover that Earth is a rich source of energy, which they can convert into Energon, their life source. The book actually states that the war between Autobots and Decepticons is currently only taking place on Earth, so that simplifies things a lot. There are some extra details worth noting as well. Each Transformer has a soul or a spark, which is infused into their chassis when they're manufactured on Cybertron. And ideologically, the Autobots want to unify all Transformers into one harmonious tribe, while the Decepticons want tyranny. It's pretty black and white in terms of morality. You'll need to seek out some of the better comic series if you want inspiration for more complex story frameworks. Just to focus in a bit on this book now, there are a few pages that dip a toe into the lore. Then it gives you a brief description of all the most popular Autobots. I'm not quite sure why they do this. I saw the same thing in the G.I. Joe core rulebook where you get a description that identifies each of the well-known characters, but it doesn't offer any stats and only occasionally provides an admittedly awesome illustration. And by the way, there are a few exceptions, but almost every last illustration in this game is top-notch. I felt a little burned at first by the $38 price tag for the PDF, but the quality of the artwork and the sheer quantity of it placated me by the end of the book. Character creation in this game is where I realized that Renegade Studios is not wanting to be very flexible with their Essence 20 system from game to game, at least comparing this to G.I. Joe. The rules, mechanics, and everything is about 95% copy and paste. I do find this underlying system very intuitive and just unique enough to be interesting, and I guess by not changing anything about the skills or the essences in any way, Renegade is trying not to rock the boat with their fans. In this video, I'll just go over everything in broad strokes and try to point out where Transformers add some new or different bits. One of the big differences for your character is that they have an alt mode. There's a bot mode and an alt mode, and maybe even 2 alt modes. You first assign 12 points to your 4 core stats or essences, then you assign just as many points that you have in each essence into ranks in your skills. Every time you level up an essence over the course of the game, you get an extra rank pip to assign to a skill under that essence. Essence scores also determine your 4 defenses, which tell you how well you defend against the 4 kinds of damage in the game. You choose from one of a small handful of influences, which will give you a perk and a personality feature. You can actually pick up to 3 influences, but your second and third one will come with a hang-up, which is a roleplay feature that, as a player, you're supposed to self-impose as a sort of flaw. What's interesting here is that these influences imply a rich and complex culture amongst Transformers that I never really imagined before. Usually you just see them fighting and driving around, but in the big scheme of things, Cybertronians have, or had, a full society with senators, arena sports, and leisure activities. I thought this hunter influence was really strange though, because by its description, you're basically Predator, which doesn't seem very Autobot-y to me. The point at which you choose your origin is in some ways the most defining moment of your play experience. It's where you define your chassis and what your bot, and more importantly your alt mode, looks like. Bot mode is always going to be a generally humanoid robot form factor, but your alt mode can be anything. You can narrow it down a bit by the origin itself, which is the underlying purpose or function of your chassis at its core. These are fairly vague in description, but they do point you towards a general idea of different kinds of alt modes, like a vehicle for land, air, or water. I'm not sure how fun it would be to be a boat as an alt mode unless the GM really focused the adventure around water. Anyway, each origin comes with a few more stats and bonuses for your character. You're also going to get a couple more complex set of bonuses through a schedule of perks and essence increases over the course of leveling up to the cap of 20 in this game. And the specific path you take for these awards is determined through the role that you choose. This is pretty much your class, and there are 7 of them. If you'll notice, Mode Master is the one that will give you a second alt mode, and you can also get a second alt mode through a general perk. Your role contains a lot of the mechanical variation in the game, in the form of perks. I think most of these perks are fun, some are boring, and some feel a little unbalanced, such as the Determine Probability perk for the Analyst, that lets you roll for an action to see if you succeed, and if you don't, you just roll a different action. But the biggest thing that jumped out at me as I was filling out a character sheet was that you will not have enough room to write out all of your perks over time, not by a long shot. The character sheet looks great from a graphic design perspective, but get ready to use 1 or 2 blank sheets of paper if you're actually going to play this game. So Essence 20 basically works like this. When you have to roll a skill check, you roll a d20 plus the die type of your skill. So if you're trying to punch an enemy, you can opt to use the Might skill. And if you have, say, a d6 rank in that skill, you'd roll a d20 and a d6 and add those up. That sum needs to meet or exceed the difficulty rating for the task. If you happen to have no ranks in a skill, then you roll with disadvantage, or what this system calls rolling with a snag, rolling 2d20 and taking the lower roll. You can also specialize in a skill, and you can pick up specializations instead of ranking up an existing skill or choosing a new skill altogether. If your skill specialization comes into play in a skill check, such as in that might check, if your bot had a martial arts specialization and did a reverse roundhouse instead of just a punch, then you would roll a d20 plus all the dice up to your skill rank in that skill. There are two things that you have to consider when rolling dice in this game. The first is the d20. It's either going to be a snag where you roll 2 and take the lower, a straight d20 roll, or rolling with edge where you roll 2d20 and you take the higher of the two. This part of the roll represents broad circumstantial benefits and luck. The second part of the roll, when you have skill dice involved, involves shift. A ton of the perks and abilities in this game have these little arrows in their description. These indicate upshifts and downshifts in your skill dice. So even though you might be ranked as high as D12 in a skill, various factors such as enemy abilities and other conditions could downshift your skill dice, or even upshift them into extremely powerful territory. This shift ladder is absolutely central to the play experience in Essence 20 games, so you'll see it a lot, especially as the GM. As far as what difficulty number you're trying to beat, here's a table that describes the range you work with in this game. There's also a whole meta currency in the game called story points. These act like the meta coin in most any RPG, where you can spend them to fudge rolls, re-roll, get items, and generally keep the story moving forward in a fun way. A second economy of points, called Energon points, are more concrete and tied to the in-game universe, but also basically double as meta currency as well. Energon can be spent to activate particular perks and upshift your dice on a skill test and things like that. I guess the idea here with Energon is that your bot can go into beast mode, not literally, that's a whole other supplement yet to be published, like a burst of high power that gives you a slight advantage in a situation. Aside from the role-specific perks, you can also pick from 38 general perks. This is honestly where a lot of the fun for players is going to be in choosing and employing these various perks. I found that the creators did inject some differentiation here from the G.I. Joe game. Perks like Human Companion are unique to Transformers, and I think it would be a lot of fun to play that one actually. Size change is pretty funny because it speaks to that weird thing that happened in the cartoons where Transformers would completely change sizes when transforming. Oh, here's one thing. The game doesn't call it transforming, they call it converting. This stems from the fact that the term Transformers is a fiercely protected trademark, and using transform as a verb is fraught with legal issues, so convert is the term they use here. And just in case you're wondering, it normally takes a standard action to convert between alt and bot forms if you're in combat. Equipment is located on your bot in two general ways: external hardpoints, or things that you hold, and internal hardpoints, which are installed within your chassis. Just like with G.I. Joe, you are given basic equipment, mission-specific equipment, and if you want upgrades or special equipment, you can roll skill tests against that equipment's difficulty rating to see if you can get that too. The rationale behind equipment scarcity here is that Autobots only have limited access to resources in their war on Earth. There isn't an exhaustive list of various weapons. Instead, weapons have a skill that is used, a size class, a style like melee or element, and effects and traits. There are actually a lot of listed effects and traits, by the way. And I guess there is an exhaustive list of weapons in the book, but only in the most general sense. The idea is that if you adopt any of these weapons for your character, you're going to want to give them more details of your own. Upgrades to your weapons are nice, but it's often not easy to acquire them. Either way, fiddling around with your equipment before a mission is definitely a feature of these Essence 20 games. Combat is pretty straightforward. You first determine surprise, and then sort out initiative order, and then everyone takes a turn. You have moves, standard actions, and free actions. A word of advice here, don't roll up a character with just 1 in speed essence. If you have just 1 speed, you can only either move or do a standard action in a turn, which will make for some very boring combat. The game addresses all the edge cases for movement that you can think of, and actually combat is meant to take place on a grid, so you might actually be able to play this game with real Transformers toys, as long as they're all to the same scale. This is kind of the most important feature of the game that I should have mentioned earlier. The steps for resolving an attack seem a bit daunting at first, but just like with any game, it gets smooth over time. Again, the most important thing to nail down is the skill dice shift table, which accounts for all the factors that affect your skill dice. Another thing that might slow down play is if everyone is high level and they have 15 different perks to look through. Since perks can be rather complex in description, this is potentially a lot for players to negotiate on their character sheets. Here's a great size class table that doesn't appear earlier in the character creation chapter. It's interesting to see the granularity in size classes between 10 feet in height and 50 feet. That's just where a majority of Transformers are in terms of size. This illustrated size chart is pretty great and gives you a good idea of how immense these machines are compared to humans. The 3D printed Transformers I've shown in this video are more or less to the 28 to 32 millimeter scale of standard minis. These are just massive machines compared to people and human scaled buildings. The threats chapter details a bunch of named Decepticons in alphabetical order, but also thankfully cross-lists this chart by threat level. That level ranges from 0 to 24. The stat blocks for most of these named bad guys are pretty massive. I think any encounter with these guys is meant to be a huge action set piece in a session. Otherwise, I don't see how a GM is supposed to manage all of these perks, attacks, and powers. One thing I noticed here that I also noticed in the G.I. Joe book is the weird, seemingly random assignment of spoken languages. Like, why does Astro Train speak Korean and Spanish? If I had one criticism about this section, which happens to be filled with epic illustrations by the way, it's that the written descriptions of each Decepticon is absolutely bare bones. Blitzwing, for example, has an incredible backstory that goes all the way back to G1. It turns out that he's one of a clone army created by the Quintessons, and when he finally realizes this, he ends up working with the Autobots. I would have loved to see juicy backstory details like this for the other entries as well. The original big bad of this whole franchise is of course Megatron, who has quite the formidable stat block. His two hang-ups listed are actually pretty comical, and probably pretty fun for the GM to play out. And here we have Starscream, whose languages include these. Honestly, if you have a theory about how these creators came up with these particular languages for each character, please share it in the comments. Thankfully, there are general threats as well, like drones and full-bodied Decepticon archetypes with no name. There are a solid 9 of these, and they're pretty important to have because you can't pit low-level Autobots against most of the named Decepticons. Alright, here are my thoughts on Transformers the RPG by Renegade Studios. Pricey PDF. Aaron Marks over at Cannibal Halfling Games wrote up a great article on the pricing of RPG PDFs. I'll leave the link down below. It's hard to summarize everything he says, but generally he makes a good point about how and why $19.99 is a magic price point for PDFs. Later in the article, he actually calls out Renegade Studios for pricing their PDFs at $38, saying it's a trick to get people to pay just a little bit more and get the print version plus PDF. And yeah, I think the $38 price point kind of feels a little high for the PDF when comparing it to the price of most other full-length RPGs. But to be honest, if and when I bring this game to my table, I will have instantly gotten my money's worth out of the digital purchase. Inadequate character sheet. As I mentioned, with all the perks and attack effects that you pick up over time, the cool looking 2-page character sheet just isn't going to cut it. The solution here is pretty simple though. Thin lore. I think it's basically an impossible task to ask writers to recap all of Transformers lore into one game setting. There have just been too many story reboots and reimaginings over the decades. And even if they could choose one storyline for the setting, it might offend the fans who subscribe to the other ones. So they played it safe and mostly used elements from the G1 cartoon and not too much else. And that makes sense, since the original cartoon is probably the most well-known and beloved media product in the whole franchise. But if you want to experience some of the more mature and interesting story elements used in the Transformers universe, you'll have to tap into the comics and other media and integrate that into your game yourself. Exquisite presentation. Renegade is one of those companies that handles multi-billion-dollar IPs from companies like Hasbro, so their artwork and layout is naturally going to be AAA. Fortunately, the underlying rule set is also compelling, otherwise the flashy art would not mean much. But yeah, the book is pretty. Essence 20 is a good fit. I guess one of the reasons Renegade hasn't changed their rule set very much from game to game is that it's pretty finely tuned. Surprisingly, the set of skills that work in G.I. Joe also work for Transformers. The rules emphasize dynamic encounters with lots of tech toys, and you never really have to die if you don't want to. You can use your toys. As long as your toys, whether they're store-bought or homemade, are all at a consistent size scale, you can totally use them as placeholders on an encounter map. The book actually mentions one problem, which is that Transformers move around quite a bit on a battlefield, so a physical map may not be able to handle full-size characters. But just use your imagination a little bit here. The way I see it, it's worth making a few sacrifices in accuracy with your map if you get to use actual Transformers in play. It's the biggest selling point of this game, in my opinion. Anyways, that's all for now. Let me know about your thoughts about this game and your experience with the Transformers universe in general. And if you'd like to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. All the links are down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.